Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think this is working. If not, I'll just, yeah, it's working well enough. Good. Okay. So welcome to this year's Halley Lecture. It's the Halley Lecture hosted by Atmospheric, Oceanic and Planetary Physics. As you know, the Halley Lecture rotates between cosmology, observational astrophysics, and AOPP, atmospheric, well, the more terrestrial-focused planetary physics that we do here in Oxford. So this is a big occasion in our triennial calendar. And it's great to see so many people here. Not surprising, considering our lecturer, Sandrine Bony, who is the Director of Research at the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique, apologies for my pronunciation, at the Laboratoire de Météorologie Dynamique at the Sorbonne. And she's one of the world's leading experts in cloud physics and climate. She did her doctorate at the LMD and also the University Pierre-Marie Curie on clouds and water vapor and their role in the Earth's radiation budget, which is kind of what you've done ever since, pretty much, which is a good thing, because it's a good problem. And it's one of those problems that keeps giving. You've contributed extensively to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and in particular the World Climate Research Programme. I think you're now the co-chair of the GWEX Global Atmospheric System Panel. And one thing you also led the very influential cloud feedback model into comparison project. It probably feels like a long time ago now, but that's something which had a huge amount of impact on our field in understanding cloud feedbacks and climate sensitivity. When I first met Sandrine, it was actually a while ago, where the older members of the audience will remember Professor Richard Lindzen, an American professor who had a theory that climate change was not a problem because water vapor feedback was of the opposite sign to what everybody thought it was. And Sandrine was presenting results at the American Geophysical Union at just the time where this row was perhaps at its peak. And so it was quite an electric atmosphere in the room, because I think everybody thought Sandrine was going to endorse their position, if you see what I mean. So both sides thought that you were going to come in and help them out. And I remember you did a fantastic job of presenting what you found completely dispassionately and saying, no, this is what the models are giving us. And that's been a hallmark of your research ever since, of helping us understand our climate, in particular comparing, using both realistic models and observations in synergy, and that's actually something which many observationalists perhaps like to use very simple models. Many modelers perhaps only sort of take an occasional passing glance at the observations. So bringing realistic models and observations together to address these really fundamental questions about our climate is something which you've really helped the world on. And so thank you for that, and thank you for giving us this year's Halley Lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Miles, for this kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and very honored to give this lecture. Today I'm going to talk about the cloud mesoscale organization. So can you hear me well, or should I put this higher? Is it better like that? Or?
Is there a mute button?
No, it's not muted.
Okay, now it's better.
So I talk like that.
Okay, maybe can we go even further? Apologies for our tech.
Like that? Is it better? Yes? Good. So I'm going to talk about the cloud mesoscale organization. So the mesoscale is an interesting scale. It's the scale that is typically between the scale of an individual cloud and what we call the large scale, several hundred kilometers. So typically it's between a few kilometers to a few hundred kilometers. And at this scale, as we can see on this satellite picture, the clouds can organize in many different ways. And they can produce very nice patterns of cloudiness, which can be very different depending on where we are, and they vary a lot from one day to the next. And so as an atmospheric scientist, we are quite fascinated by the richness of this organization at the small scale. And we'd like to understand why we have such a diversity of cloud organizations or cloud patterns. And as a climate scientist, we also wonder whether the small-scale features and small-scale organization of clouds might be important for the climate. And if today we find these cloud patterns fascinating, we are certainly not the first ones to be fascinated by those, because already in the 60s, when the first satellite observations of the Earth, satellite pictures became available, then Ed Lawrence was one of the most enthusiastic scientists about these pictures. And he really thought that it was very stimulating to see those pictures because it was already challenging his understanding of how the atmosphere works and how it organizes. So nowadays, we have plenty of satellite pictures at very high resolution, so we can see all the ways in which clouds that we see in white here can organize, so how they can arrange spatially. And the first thing we see is that these fine-scale cloud structures are really ubiquitous on Earth. And so we really wonder whether it's important for climate. And one important reason why it's become such a vivid area of research in atmospheric science is also because the mesoscale connects to many of the main questions or puzzles of climate science. And I'm going to illustrate a few of those puzzles. As you might know, the clouds on average have a cooling effect on climate, mostly because they reflect solar radiation more than they contribute to the greenhouse effect. And one of the big questions that we have as climate scientists is to figure out how the clouds might respond or might change in a warmer climate. And depending on how the cooling effect of clouds will be stronger, which might damp global warming, or whether the cooling effect might weaken, which would amplify global warming. And among the clouds that are the most efficient at cooling the Earth are those stratocumulus decks that form on the eastern side of the ocean basins, for instance. And if you look at these cloud decks in a little bit more details, you see that they exhibit actually a lot of fine-scale structures. And sometimes they exhibit closed cell structures or open cell structures. And the albedo of these clouds, or their ability to reflect solar radiation, very much depends on the morphology of those clouds at the mesoscale. So if we want to figure out how those clouds might contribute to the warming of the planet in the future, we have to understand how these different organizations form and how they might change or evolve in a warmer climate. Stratocumulus clouds are just one type of low-level clouds that act to cool the climate, but most of the low-level clouds on Earth are shallow cumuli. So there are clouds which do not exceed 2 or 3 kilometers high, and they cover most of the trade wind regions, in the subtropics in particular. And the mesoscale organization of these clouds has been extensively studied in this area over the western tropical Atlantic, because we had a field campaign there a few years ago. And we've shown that these clouds can organize, or can exhibit prominent patterns of organization. And I'm illustrating here 2 of these patterns. So here we have the Caribbean islands. Barbados is here, and Guadeloupe, Martinique. And that's a scale here, 100 kilometers. And you can see that on 2 different days, we can have completely different spatial arrangements of these clouds. It's quite spectacular. And it's not only spectacular, it also matters for the radiation budget of the Earth, because in this case, the planetary albedo, so the reflection of solar radiation, is much larger than in this case. So again, in a climate change context, we need to figure out how this organization of clouds might evolve in a warmer climate to be able to predict the magnitude of global warming with a good precision. But the mesoscale organization is not only a matter of for shallow convection or shallow clouds, low-level clouds. It's also occurs in deep clouds. So I'm sorry the resolution is not so good on the big screen. Anyway, so here on this detail of the tropical Atlantic, we have a mixture of many different cloud types. So here we have, for instance, very, very shallow clouds that look like sugar powdered on the ocean. And here we have also low-level clouds, but they are a little bit more clustered, and they reflect more solar radiation. But in between, we have very deep clouds. So there are clouds that can reach 13, 15 kilometers or more. And these deep clouds can organize in many ways. They can form bands like that, for instance, or they can form in isolation, or they can organize as what we call mesoscale convective systems, and which are the systems that give a lot of precipitation. And the way the deep convection organizes is very important for the intensity of precipitation extremes, for instance. When the clouds are more clustered, then the precipitation extremes are even more extremes than otherwise. So if we want to, one of the main challenges of our field is understanding what controls the precipitation at the regional scale. And for this purpose, we need to figure out how the deep convection organizes spatially. And also predicting precipitation extremes requires to understand how much clouds or deep clouds can cluster and form these extremes. So many of the climate challenges are really connected to what's going on at this mesoscale. And interestingly, for a long time, we've been studying climate and climate change with models that did not resolve the mesoscale because they didn't have the spatial resolution for that. But nowadays, things are changing because there is a new generation of models which is emerging with global weather and climate models that now can simulate the atmosphere at the kilometer scale globally. So it's the first time that we can both simulate the mesoscale and its interaction with the large scale and climate. So it's the very beginning of this enterprise, and we'll see how much the climate and climate change simulations with these models differ from what we've got so far with the traditional models. But it's a very exciting time to be able now to resolve all these scales. And so at first sight, so here you have an intercomparison of 9 or 10, or I don't know, many of those models compared to observations, which is one of those globes. And at first sight, they look quite the same. So it looks like those models look realistic. But actually, if you look a little bit closer, and here I've extracted a few of those models compared to observations, you see that at the mesoscale, these models predict a spatial arrangement of clouds quite differently. For instance, in this model, convection are quite scattered, while in this model, the convection is much more clustered. So if you want to study precipitation extremes statistics, for instance, in these two models, probably the statistics will be quite different for this reason. So the fact that, so it's the very beginning of those models, they still need some improvement, but at the moment it's very difficult to know why this model predicts more clustering than this one, for instance. And it's because to answer this question, we need first to understand what controls the clustering of convection of clouds. And so that leads us to the next question, which is what causes clouds to organize at the mesoscale? And understanding the organization of clouds at the mesoscales means two different things, complementary things. It means understanding the relative proportion of shallow and deep clouds, because in convective atmospheres, usually you have a mixture of different cloud types, some shallow ones and some deep ones, in various proportions. So we need to understand why we have shallow or deep ones. And we need to understand what controls the spacing between clouds or their ability to aggregate and cluster. And for a long time, we thought that the clustering of clouds was mostly driven by large-scale factors, like the atmospheric waves, There are plenty of tropical waves, for instance, in the atmosphere. Or it was related to rotation or to spatial gradients in the boundary conditions and so on. But this view completely changed now it's some time ago, maybe over the last decade, thanks to very idealized experiments, which have been done with models that predict clouds at a very, very fine scale. So they have a resolution of 100 meters, something like that. And when these models could be run on domains that were large enough, so several hundred kilometers, then these clouds could interact with a large-scale atmosphere. And so in these very idealized experiments that in our jargon we call radiative convective equilibrium experiments, all the boundary conditions are perfectly homogeneous. There is no gradient in surface temperature, no rotation, no large-scale waves, nothing. And if at the beginning of the simulation clouds are randomly positioned in the domain, what we observe is that after some time, the clouds spontaneously aggregate and form clusters. So there can be one or several clusters in the domain, depending on the size of the domain, but it's a behavior that was not expected at the beginning. And, but it was found repeatedly by many people in many studies. And so we name this spontaneous clustering of clouds self-aggregation. So it's really, what it demonstrated is that this aggregation of clouds can be due solely to the interaction between clouds and their environment or between clouds and clouds. But it doesn't need any external driver to occur. So that was a big change in the way we understood this problem. The second thing that we learned from all the studies on self-aggregation is the fact that the clustering develops at the same time as mesoscale circulations connecting the dry and moist areas. And the circulations develop in the lower atmosphere, in the first kilometers of the atmosphere, and they are really important in this process. And third, the thing that we've learned from the studies is that so the clustering of convection has a big impact on the intensity of precipitation extremes, as I said earlier, but also they have an impact on the large-scale state of the atmosphere. And in particular, in this state, the atmosphere on average over the domain is much drier than in this state, while the boundary conditions are exactly the same. And so that was a very interesting result, because then it suggests that maybe the way convection organizes at the mesoscale can have an impact on the large scale and therefore on climate. So that stirred a lot of interest and a lot of studies in the community. So that's what the questions I'd like to address then in the rest of this presentation is whether the mesoscale organization matters for the large scale, for climate. And I will address in particular two issues, two particular aspects of climate. First, the atmospheric circulation, and second, the Earth radiation budget. Obviously, I will not give a definitive answer about whether or not it matters for climate, but just hints of what we've learned recently about this. And then I will share with you some recent insights that we got about some key physical processes that we think are governing the mesoscale organization of clouds. So first of all, how does the mesoscale organization of convection affect the atmospheric circulations in the atmosphere? Atmospheric circulation, sorry. So as I said earlier, one of the circulations that develops at the mesoscale, which is important for the clustering, it's what we've learned from the models at least, is those shallow circulations that we call shallow mesoscale overturning circulations, or SMOCs, that develop at the same time as the aggregation. So we wanted to see whether we could detect those circulations in nature. And as you might know, it's very difficult to measure vertical motions in the atmosphere because the magnitude of the vertical motions are much, much weaker than the magnitude of the horizontal wind components. But a few years ago, with Björn Stevens, we showed that we could measure the vertical motions at the mesoscale by using drop zones. So drop zones are those things that you can drop from an aircraft, and during their fall, they measure different things, but in particular, they measure the horizontal wind. And so if you have an aircraft that flies large circles, here it's about 200 kilometers, but it can be several tens of kilometers. And if you drop zones intensively along this circle, then in each point you measure the vertical profile of the horizontal wind. And from this you can measure the divergence of the wind, the mass divergence, and then by integrating upward, you can get the large-scale vertical motion, well, at the mesoscale, at the scale averaged over this circle. So here, yeah, there is no x-axis for some reason, but it should be 8 kilometers. So this technique seems to work quite well to measure vertical motions at the mesoscale, and it's been used intensively during several recent field campaigns. And it's how we showed evidence for those smokes, those shallow mesoscale circulations. It's been found that the circulations are really ubiquitous in the lower troposphere, so within the first few kilometers of the atmosphere. They cover a large fraction of the subtropical ocean, and they are closely associated with cloud clustering. And in terms of mechanism, several hypotheses have been formulated about the mechanisms that can produce the circulations. It's been suggested initially that they could arise from radiative processes, and the fact that between the clear sky and cloudy regions, the radiative cooling was different, and that was enough to produce those mesoscale circulations. But more recently, it's been shown that even without radiative processes, just the heating by shallow convection, so the condensation of water in clouds, is enough actually to drive the shallow circulations. Then other types of circulations that we expect to see at the mesoscale are the circulations which are around clouds. Convective clouds are transporting air upward, so by mass conservation you expect air to subside down around the clouds. And although there was some water somewhere, I think. Oh, yeah. Sorry. We also expect the convective clouds to generate gravity waves when they form. And for a long time, we didn't really have clear, nice observations to look at those mesoscale circulations. But things have changed recently, and partly thanks to the PhD work of my student Basile Pujol, who's shown that by looking at the infrared radiation in the water vapor channel of geostationary satellites, so it's a channel where the water vapor absorbs a lot of infrared radiation. By looking at the time variation of this, we can retrieve the vertical velocity in clear skies. The principle is quite simple. When there is subsidence, the emission level goes down, so the temperature emitted, the brightness temperature increases. And so if we look at time variations of the brightness temperature in this channel, if after we correct for the horizontal moisture advection, we can get some information about the vertical velocity at that level. So the emission level in the tropics is around 5 kilometers about, so it's in the mid-troposphere. And with this methodology that we have evaluated in multiple ways, obviously, we can retrieve the vertical velocity of the clear sky atmosphere at a resolution of 2 kilometers and at the hourly time scale. So it's really, we can look for the first time really at, from space observations at vertical velocities at the mesoscale. And this is what we get. It's a snapshot of the clear sky vertical velocities at a resolution of 2 kilometers, as seen from the GOES satellite, so that's South America here. And the first thing you see is that it's extremely heterogeneous. So when you look at the water vapor channel here, you see, it seems that in the clear sky regions, it's really quite uniform. But if you look at the dynamics, it's really far from being uniform. There are waves everywhere. Most of the color here is yellow or red, which means that we have subsidence. And actually, we expect the air to go to subside down in between clouds. But we were surprised to see that there are large regions in the mid-troposphere where we can find upward motion. And actually, we could see that it's related to the passage of tropical waves that usually we detect them in the cloudiness, but in clear sky, when there are no clouds, we can also detect the tropical waves in the vertical motion. The other thing that we see that there are many fine-scale structures, like stripes, that you can see here, and they look like gravity waves emitted by clouds. And actually, we could verify that they do correspond to gravity waves by looking at the time-space spectrum, energy spectrum, and based on this data, and we can see that they match very well the dispersion relationships of gravity waves that we expect in the troposphere. And finally, what we noticed is that around deep convective systems, like here, for instance, or here, we have a strong subsidence. And actually, if we look at this a little bit systematically, we see a strong enhanced subsidence around organized convective systems. And we can show that it's, well, from theoretical background, that this subsidence is expected actually to decay away from the clouds and to be controlled both by the cloud depth and the cloud size and the mass flux. So it seems that there's a lot going on in the dynamics of the atmosphere at the mesoscale, and the question is how much does it imprint the large-scale circulation, or the circulation on a larger scale? And to address this question, what we did is that we averaged the vertical velocity data that were originally at a resolution of 2 kilometers. We averaged them at a resolution of 1 degree by 1 degree, so about 100 kilometers. By 100 kilometers, so that's a typical scale that climate models would resolve, for instance. And we looked at how the subsidence evolves around clouds. So here I'm showing you a composite showing the magnitude of the subsidence of the air in clear sky as a function of the distance to the nearest cloud. So far from the cloud, we have subsidence rate, which is very close to what we expect from the clear sky radiative cooling, right? Where far from the clouds, we have some balance between the warming by subsidence and the cooling by clear sky emission, radiative cooling. But we see that close to the clouds, we really have a strong increase of the subsidence that we see here. And we see this enhanced subsidence even when we average at a 1 by 1 degree resolution. It's because this enhanced subsidence actually extends over several hundred kilometers. Now we can wonder whether atmospheric reanalysis reproduce this. So for the moment, most of what we know about the atmosphere, atmospheric vertical motions, comes from meteorological reanalysis, and like ERA 5. And what we see here is that in reanalysis, we get quite a different picture. So the subsidence far from clouds is not that different from what we measure. But close to the clouds, we see that the subsidence is very different in the reanalysis. And that's maybe not very surprising, because in reanalysis, well, the reanalysis is based on models and observations, but the models do not resolve the mesoscale. So maybe it's the reason why we don't see that. And then you can wonder whether those new models that simulate the atmosphere at the kilometer scale do a better job. So that's what we're starting to look at. And I'm showing you some results for 3 different versions, 2 models. So the ICON model run at 10 kilometer is here. So you see that far from clouds, it agrees with observations, but close to the clouds, the model does not reproduce this enhanced subsidence at all. When we run this model at a higher resolution, it's not on this plot, but we can also run this model at 2.5 kilometer resolution, or we can look at the IFS model, so the model used at developed at ECMWF. Also at high resolution, we see that it does a much better job close to the clouds. We start seeing this enhanced subsidence. So it suggests that to get this vertical motion right close to the clouds, we really need to resolve the clouds at the mesoscale. Okay, so now I will turn to the second question, which is whether the mesoscale organization matters for the Earth radiation budget. And the reason why we ask this question is, again, very much motivated by those very idealized modeling studies showing that when convection is more clustered, then on average the atmosphere is drier and we have an enhanced radiative cooling to space of the atmosphere. So this is very idealized simulations, but we wanted to see whether in observations as well we can see something similar. So what we did, we considered the tropics as a whole, and we said, okay, let's characterize the degree of aggregation of deep clouds in the tropics through a single number. That's a very popular tropical organization index that is used in the community, that is named IORG, that is based on the statistics of the distances between the nearest neighbors. So we detect all the convective points, and then we look at the distance between them, and we can figure out how much the clouds are clustered. So when it increases, it means that convection is more clustered. And we used microwave measurements of the free tropospheric humidity. So the humidity are around 5 kilometers or so in the mid-troposphere. And we looked at the tropical means of the humidity. And what we find is that there is a strong anticorrelation between the two. So when convection is more clustered, on average, the atmosphere is drier. So that's consistent with the simulation. But actually here there is an arrow, but it should be a double arrow because the relationship goes in both directions. When the atmosphere is drier, there is also more clustering. But anyway, it's consistent with what has been seen in simulations. And we can also look at the Earth radiation budget measured from space by satellite. It's a series data set. And we see as well that when there is a stronger clustering in the tropics, and we have a negative radiative cooling, so the Earth is cooling radiatively more efficiently. And it's mostly due to the fact that because the atmosphere is drier, there is more clear sky long-wave radiation emitted to space. But obviously, the Earth radiation budget does not only depend on deep convection. It also depends a lot on low-level clouds. And people have shown for a long time that a way to look at this was to look at the influence of the lower tropospheric stability, because there is a strong link between the presence of low-level clouds and the stability of the lower troposphere. And indeed, when the stability in the lower troposphere is higher, we have more cooling of the atmosphere because we have more low-level clouds. But the influence of the lower tropospheric stability here is through the shortwave component of the Earth radiation budget, because it's related to low-level clouds, while the influence of the convective organization is mostly in the long wave and in the clear sky. So it's two different components of the Earth radiation budget. And those two influences are largely independent of each other. Then we asked whether, just based on those two quantities, we could predict the month-to-month variations of the tropical mean radiation budget. And the answer is largely yes. We can reproduce fairly well the time variability of the tropical mean radiation budget just based on the multiple regression and these two predictors. So the main thing which is interesting is that so the lower tropospheric stability was recognized for a long time as being an important modulator of the Earth radiation budget through its impact on low-level clouds. But what we see is that the impact of deep convective organization is is as strong actually as the impact of the lower tropospheric stability. So it suggests that the organization, mesoscale organization of clouds, really has a huge impact on the Earth radiation budget. It's not just something minor. And because the organization of convection has such a strong impact on the Earth radiation budget, it raises the question of how the role that it might play in the future in a warming climate, and whether it could induce some climate feedbacks. If, for instance, we think that in a warmer climate, let's assume that we have more clustering of convection, then it means that maybe it will make the atmosphere drier and it will induce a negative feedback on the warming. So we don't know if this is the case. Actually, in observations, if we look at the relationship between temperature and convective aggregation, we don't see any relationship. But the internal variability is not necessarily a good analog of global climate change. So we can ask the models what they have to say about this. So we looked at two models that simulate the atmosphere at the mesoscale, IFS and ICON. And as I said earlier, these models predict the organization of convection quite differently. For instance, this model, the ICON model, predicts a convection which is in general much more scattered than the IFS model. But still, we can look at what they have to say. But just remembering that we need a grain of salt when considering those results, because those models are far from being perfect in simulating the mesoscale organization of convection. In the present day, the organization depends on the model we look at. But what we've seen is that it also depends very strongly on the model resolution. So if we look at different simulations of the ICON model at 20 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 5 kilometers, and we looked also at 2.5 kilometer resolution globally, the degree of aggregation of convection is quite different. The convection is much more clustered at fine resolution than at coarse resolution. But still, we can use this model in idealized experiments. We prescribe a global warming of the planet in those models, and we can look at how the organization responds. And that's what is shown in purple here. And what we see is that at coarse resolution, the clustering of convection seems to increase quite a lot in a warmer climate, but at fine resolutions, we have hardly any change. The organization doesn't seem to depend on the temperature of the planet at all. Whether or not it's credible, we don't know. Again, in the current climate, it doesn't seem that we have a strong link between organization and temperature. But still, we still don't know how credible is this result. But what we see is that it's very much sensitive on the model setup, on the resolution, and probably the physics of the model as well. So what it tells us is that we really need to assess the model organization at the process level to know whether the models organize the clouds and the convection for the right reasons, for the right physical processes. And so it brings me to the next issue that I wanted to talk about here, is what are the physical processes underlying for the mesoscale organization of convection. So based on many decades of atmospheric physics studies, we've learned a few things, in particular the fact that convective clouds are very much rooted in the boundary layer, in the first few hundred meters of the atmosphere. In particular, they are rooted in coherent structures that develop in the boundary layer that we call thermals, that rise moist air. And when the thermals exceed the condensation level, then they saturate and they produce a cloud. Okay, so, and once we have a cloud base, a cloud that starts forming, then the growth of this cloud and how deep it will go very much depends on the size of the base, of the cloud base. If a cloud is really wide, then it means that it will be the air inside the cloud will be less affected by the turbulent mixing at the edge of the cloud. And therefore, the updraft will develop much more easily than if it's a tiny cloud, and turbulence at the edge of cloud will reduce the buoyancy of the cloud very quickly, and the cloud will not develop vertically very much. So the size of the cloud base matters for understanding how deep the cloud will develop. And then if the cloud develops enough, then a lot of condensation is produced, and part of this condensate will precipitate. And during its fall, part of the precipitation re-evaporates. And by re-evaporating, it generates cold downdraft and generates a pool of cold air that spreads out near the surface. And at the edge of this cold pool, I call that cold pool, then the new convective cells form because it raises air masses at the edge. And that's the reason why we often see this circular patterns over the ocean, for instance, where we probably had a convective precipitating cloud here, and then the cold pool was producing other clouds at the edge. We can see that very well also from satellite observations. You see the structures here. So that's also one way through which clouds can organize or can interact with each other, and that can act to influence the mesoscale pattern, mesoscale organization of clouds. And finally, another process that I talked already about is this mesoscale circulations, which are associated with clouds. In particular, the subsidence around clouds can prevent other clouds from developing, because if we have a subsiding motion, obviously it will prevent clouds to deepen around. So all this can play a role in the mesoscale organization, but the question is how those different processes can work together to produce the different patterns that we see. So the way we try to conceptualize this, and we try to put all this together is in the following way. We imagine that in the boundary layer we have coherent structures like sommers or cold pools. And the structures control the size distribution of cloud bases. So if we have an isolated sommer, maybe it will give rise to a small cloud base. If we have a high density of sommers, maybe we'll have larger cloud base. And the size distribution of cloud bases will control the vertical geometry of the cloud. So the wider the cloud base, the deeper the cloud will develop. And then, depending on the cloud geometry, it will influence the circulation, mesoscale circulation around. If we have a deep cloud, we'll have a strong subsidence around. That will influence the water vapors, distribution of water vapor around clouds. And so that's how we tried mentally to connect all those different processes together. And it's really based on what we've learned from tons of modeling studies or individual process observations. But what we wanted to try is to observe all this together and show some evidence of the interplay between all those processes and the mesoscale organization of convection. And for this, we need observations. And so this is for this reason that I proposed and organized this Maestro field campaign that took care last year near Cape Verde. And it was part of a larger international field campaign that was named Orchestra, that was also about understanding the mesoscale organization of convection. And in this Maestro field campaign, we had a research aircraft that was equipped with a lot of instrumentation, in situ measurements, but also remote sensing with LiDARs and radars, looking at the atmosphere in different directions, so that we can probe the atmosphere below the clouds, around the clouds, within the clouds, and so on. And also we used satellite observations, of course, and a lot of soundings. And this field campaign was complementary to another field campaign that Jan Stevens and myself organized 5 years ago in Barbados, so on the other side of the Atlantic. That was named Eureka, that took place here, in which we used several research aircraft. We had the German aircraft flying large circles in the upper troposphere and dropping many sondes to measure the thermodynamic state of the atmosphere under the mesoscale circulation. And we had the French aircraft flying in the lower troposphere with all its remote sensing and in situ measurements. And this campaign took place for a month. And during this month, we sampled many different types of cloud organizations. This is just a snapshot of one day during this campaign. So Barbados, the Barbados Island is here. It's about 20 kilometers in this direction and in this direction. And for instance, here you see that cloud, so it's only based, the campaign took place during winter, so it's mostly shallow convection. It's only low-level clouds, low-level cumulus clouds. The highest cloud is maybe 3 or 4 kilometers high. And you see that sometimes we have this type of sugar organization, sometimes we have deeper clouds. And with Eureka observations, we could connect those different patterns to the type of clouds that was present in each case. So when we have this type of sugar organization, then we had mostly only those very tiny clouds that hardly exceed the condensation level. They are very, very thin. But when we had this type of clouds here, of organization, then we had deeper clouds that were precipitating. Also, they were not very high, very deep. And some of them, this one, for instance, was producing a stratiform layer at the top, like an anvil. But that was at 2 to 3 kilometers. So it's like a big convective system that produces an anvil, but it's a shallow one. And using the measurements from the aircraft, we wanted to understand how we could get these different cloud types and how they organize themselves. And so using the in situ measurements on board the aircraft, we had very high frequency water vapor measurements at 25 Hertz. So we had a spatial resolution of about 4 meters. So from this, we can look at the fluctuations of humidity along the trajectory of the aircraft, and we can detect thermals. And so we can count the thermals that we cross with the aircraft, and we can measure their size. And then we can look at the size distribution of the thermals. So when we were flying very low near the ocean surface, at 60 meters above the surface, we had thermals which on average had a size of about 100 meters, so quite small. And their size distribution was exponentially distributed. When we were flying higher up in the subcloud layer, so still below the clouds, but higher up, then we had a much lower density of thermals, and we had wider thermals. And the size distribution of thermals in the subcloud layer or near the cloud base level was not characterized by an exponential distribution but by the sum of 2 exponential distributions. We had a mixture of 2 populations of thermals, one population of very small thermals, which on average has a size of about 100 meters, like near the surface, and a second population of wider thermals of about 300 meters. And so because we had, when we go higher in the boundary layer, we have fewer thermals but wider thermals, we thought that maybe it was due to the merging of thermals as they rise. And on board the aircraft, we also had remote sensing, LiDARs and radars, looking horizontally through the aircraft windows. And from this, we could measure the size distribution of clouds at their base. And if we look at the size distribution of cloud chord length, we see that again, we have a distribution whose size distribution can be very well fitted by a sum of two exponential distributions with one population of clouds or cloud cohorts, which is about the mean size of a single thermal, and the second population of clouds, which of wider clouds, which is about the size of the boundary layer and the size of several thermals. So again, we thought that maybe there was some merging of clouds that was producing this. And actually, so that's the size distribution we got when we put all the flights together, but the distributions that we get from was varying a lot from one flight to the next. Sometimes we had a single mode, and sometimes we had two. So we were wondering how this variability could relate to the size population of thermals below the clouds. And also we wonder whether when we had these large clouds, it could arise from the merging of clouds, which is something that John Simpson had suggested a long time ago that could play an important role in the growth of clouds. But so here we've looked at observations only, and to better interpret the observations, we thought that we should think a little bit more analytically or theoretically, and wonder how the merging could affect the size distribution of objects. So we asked with my students, Basil Pujol and Brett McKim, we asked the question, okay, let's imagine that we have a distribution of objects with an initial density d naught and a mean size L naught, and the size distribution is exponential. Then let's imagine that two objects merge if they touch each other. And we can understand that the merging efficiency will depend on the product of d naught and L naught. If we have higher density of objects or bigger objects, obviously the merging will be easier. And so what will be the size distribution of objects after merging? And it takes quite a long mathematical derivation to show this, but Basil Pujol was quite good at this, managed to do it. And he showed that actually the size distribution after merging tends towards a sum of two exponential functions, with a very clear meaning of each exponential distribution. The first mode here, or the first exponential distribution, corresponds to the size distribution of the objects that have not merged yet, while the second distribution corresponds to the size distribution of the merged object. And then we can predict the length scales of those two distributions and the refraction or the density of those objects, etc., only based on the merging efficiency. And actually, during the course of this work, we realized that the merging efficiency does not only depend on the density and the length of the object, but also on the influence that one object can have on other objects around, and in particular through the circulations which are induced by the convective objects. So both thermals and clouds induce circulations around them. And through the circulation, they can attract other objects which are in their vicinity, and that will facilitate the merging. So it's it's mathematically completely equivalent to considering that the length of the object is not L naught, but beta L naught with beta larger than 1. And so we can express everything exactly in the same way, except that the merging efficiency is multiplied by a factor beta. And then from this, we can predict the length scales of the two populations of objects, the unmerged ones and the merged ones, as a function of the merging efficiency. And we can predict the density of merged and unmerged objects. And we see that when the merging efficiency is strong enough, then we start having a decrease of the density of objects because we produce wider and wider, or bigger objects, but fewer and fewer because of the merging. And so we have a decrease of the density here. Okay, then that's purely analytical calculations, but to make sure that it was not completely unmeaningful, we wanted to test this with simple statistical calculations and simulations. So what we did is that we considered a 1D domain, and we considered objects that we call SOMORs, but they are just segments that we introduce one at a time in the domain, following a Poisson process, with a certain density, length scale, and so on. And if they touch each other, they merge, and then we look at the end at the size distribution that we get. And we get results which are very consistent with what we found in the mathematical calculation. So that further supports the idea that this size distribution, well fitted by a sum of two exponential, is relates to the results from the merging process. And the beauty of this framework is that, so if we know the properties, the merging efficiency, we can predict the length scales of the size distributions. But because we have analytical relationships to do that, we can do the opposite. And from the size distributions, we can infer the merging efficiency and the density and length scale of the objects before merging, so that are consistent with the size distribution that we observe afterwards. So we applied this to the observations from the Eureka field campaign. We had 18 flights, and we sampled a large diversity of mesoscale organizations, as you see here. And we measured the mass flux for each of these cases. We measured virtually everything. And we tried to understand how the coupling between SOMORs and clouds and organization was working. And what we found is that there is a strong link between the type of pattern that we get here and the merging efficiency of SOMORs and clouds. Here, in this type of patterns, we have a very weak SOMOR merging efficiency, and here we have a very strong merging efficiency. And the way we can understand the interplay between SOMORs and clouds in producing these patterns is the following. So near the surface, we have plenty of SOMORs, small SOMORs, which are initially unmerged. And then when the SOMORs rise in the boundary layer, some of them merge, and they produce wider SOMORs. Okay? And then when the SOMORs reach the condensation level, then they will produce a small cloud, which initially has the same size as a SOMOR that gave rise to it. So we can call this cloud shoots. And so if we have a weak SOMOR merging, it means that we will have a high density of SOMORs. So we will have many cloud shoots close to each other, and they will merge easily and will produce a large cloud base. And because the cloud base is large, then the cloud can deepen easily. And so we'll have a strong mass flux and a deep cloud. On the other hand, when we have a strong SOMOR merging, it means that we have wider SOMORs, but fewer SOMORs. They are more isolated and far from each other. And therefore, we have few cloud shoots, and so a smaller cloud base, and therefore the clouds develop less vertically. But because the SOMORs are wider and more isolated, the lifetime of the SOMORs is longer, of the clouds is longer. And then for the cloud has time to form this stratiform cloudiness at the top. And through this process, we can understand that the anticorrelation between SOMOR merging and cloud merging acts as a negative feedback on the growth of the mesoscale circulations. So this guy can produce, well, if we have many convective clouds like that, we can produce a mesoscale circulation that will develop. But the process that can prevent this circulation from running away is because at this point, if we had a lot of SOMOR here, at some point they will end up merging, so that will decrease the mass flux, and so that will regulate the circulation. Okay, so we think that by analyzing all these observations, we better understand why we can have different types of patterns. It doesn't answer all the questions, of course, but at least we think that there is the merging process of SOMORs in the boundary layer plays a very important role in controlling these patterns, and other aspects that I didn't have time to discuss here. We looked at this in regimes of shallow convection, and we can wonder how much universal is this process and whether it happens also in regimes of deep convection, for instance. And that's why we're now looking at the Maestro field campaign that sampled deep convection as well. And from what we've seen so far, it seems to be the case that we still have the same type of behavior for the thermals. And now if we want to understand how these different patterns depend on environmental conditions and how they might change in the future climate, we have to understand how this merging process might evolve with different environmental conditions. So I will stop here. I hope I was not too long. Just to summarize that the mesoscale organization of clouds and convection is absolutely ubiquitous on Earth. We have some evidence now that it influences the atmospheric circulations on the large scale and also the Earth radiation balance, but we still don't really know the role that it might play in climate change. I hope we'll make progress on this over the next years. We have now a generation of climate models that can resolve partly the mesoscale and also the large scale. And they start to capture or to represent this mesoscale organization, but clearly there are still important challenges in the way they do it. And in parallel, we have collected new observations which can really help understand how this organization works. And we've pointed out a process that takes place in the very first kilometers of the atmosphere that can control the organization of shallow clouds. But what is not clear yet, but we are now working on this, is trying to understand the role that the large-scale subsidence might play also in shaping these organizations, which might be more important for the organization of deep convection. And so I hope that I illustrated the fact that it's understanding the cloud patterns at the mesoscale is really a very rich area of research, and that connects, that is quite fascinating, and I hope that many of you will want to contribute to unravel those mysteries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, for a really beautiful lecture, as well as a fascinating topic as well. And it's interesting to see how the richness of this whole this whole area of research. There's so much still to be done. I'm sure there are questions, take it away.
So when you showed us the pictures of the air going up or down vertically, you showed these pictures that you had a color code, and they were mostly orange for air coming up. But then there were just...
Orange when it was going down.
Pardon me?
Orange was going down.
Orange was going... Okay, now that makes more sense to me, because I misunderstood the color code. But,
because it's in hectopascal per
So I guess that connects with your picture of the cloud, showing the cold pole being a big thing.
Yeah.
So then there must be, the air going up must be much more concentrated.
Yes.
In order to...
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
So I'm an engineer interested in the impact of transport, not an atmospheric physicist, but if I understood correctly, you said that low-level clouds lead to lower troposphere stability, which means more cooling.
It's more the opposite. When the air is very stable, we have mostly low-level clouds, and low-level clouds cool the Earth.
Yes.
Because they reflect solar radiation, but they don't contribute to the Earth's greenhouse effect. So they have a cooling effect on them.
Yeah, from albedo effect?
Yes.
Yes. So the removal of aerosols from burning coal and from burning shipping fuels, which form low-level clouds and cause cooling by the albedo effect, is there another aspect to that, because that's affecting the lower troposphere stability by removing those clouds and changing?
So far, I think the impact of aerosols on clouds has not been discussed so much in terms of changing the stability of the atmosphere, but more in terms of microphysical processes. The fact that when you have more aerosols, then the same amount of condensed water can be distributed over more droplets, and the droplets are smaller, so that reflects solar radiation more efficiently.
So you get a more optically dense cloud. Yeah, yeah. because some of those, with the shipping lanes in particular, it's very condensed in certain regions, and some of the papers, I've tried to understand this, obviously limited climate science understanding, but they seem to think about the global impact rather than localised impacts, whereas actually with shipping lanes you've got a very condensed effect over the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, for example, in certain areas where there are a lot of ships.
You have the specialist here.
Oh, really?
This.
Okay.
That's one for the reception.
Yeah, that's definitely one for the reception. No.
Ask Philippe. Yeah.
It was very cool to see that your 1D model of merging thermals actually fits the observations kind of well, so it's quite surprising that this works. But on this, maybe I've understood this wrong, but as far as I understood it, it's that you essentially make the assumption about a thermal being like not actually changing size in the vertical, only when they merge they basically grow. So you're essentially making more an assumption of like them being like a cylinder instead of something like more 3D D-shaped. If I look at this picture now, sure, there are some structures that I could say like, oh, well, it's kind of roughly a cylinder, many others that aren't. And so I'm wondering how much is that, like, why does the theory still work so well?
Yeah, that's a question we ask ourselves. Obviously, the thermals do not, well, the size of the thermals is not only controlled by the merging process. For instance, entrainment at the edge of the thermal contributes to grow, to make the thermals larger as they rise. But if the size distribution of the thermals was only controlled by entrainment, then we would have wider thermals, but not a reduced density of thermals as we go up, right? And indeed, in our derivations, we did not assume that thermals were growing by entrainment, for instance. Apparently, it doesn't, at first sight, it doesn't prevent us from reproducing the size distribution that we observe. It doesn't mean that the growth by turbulence by entrainment is not important. But what it will do, I think, it will just increase the merging efficiency by increasing the size at a given level. So if you have larger objects due to this entrainment process, then you will just facilitate the merging even more. But to explain why we have these two populations of thermals, I think just considering the merging effect seems to be enough.
Tim.
So I was going to go off a slight tangent for a second. You talked a bit about climate models. And of course, there's a lot of, as you well know, a lot of discussion at the moment about how AI can be used in climate models. And to date, most of it seems to be around using AI to maybe produce faster parameterizations or maybe better parameterizations, I don't know. But looking at the sort of extraordinary quality data that you've shown today, makes me wonder whether we're not thinking about this in the right way, and in the sense that would it be possible to use AI to actually, trained on all these fantastic observations that you've got, to actually be able to incorporate these like mesoscale structures within the dynamical core of the model. So you'd be coupling, a physics-based model on the large scale to a dynamical core that would have learned about these like closed cells and open cells and mesoscale structures. And so when the large scale had the right, say, large scale subsidence structure, for example, subsidence or humidity structure, the AI would know to kind of create the right types of mesoscale patterns, and then that would feed back into the large scale again. I just wonder whether there's scope for using, I just feel when people just try to use data like this to devise parameterizations, they're a little bit throwing the baby out of the bathwater. And maybe we should be rethinking how we can use like your fantastic observations in a more constructive way for improving models and getting the sort of things that you say we're still not really getting right even with 1 kilometre resolution. So I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, for sure, AI could be used for much more than accelerating the models. I'm not a specialist this at all. There are people in the room who know much more about this than me, but indeed, I think that AI could be useful to help us unravel some of the key predictors of the organization of clouds. First of all, because with AI we can very easily recognize different shapes. It's been used actually to differentiate the different patterns that we can find. And maybe it could be used together with field observations, as you said, to maybe help us unravel what are the predictors or the physical processes. Here we've done this in the old way, I would say, trying to build on what we know about atmospheric physics. And, that's a good idea. And if maybe it could be a way to introduce a representation of the mesoscale organization in the low-cost models, or even in the kilometer scale models that do not represent well the shallow clouds, for instance, and their organization. Yeah.
I'm trying to pick on people I don't know. So in the middle there, next to Neil. And then you can pass the mic to Neil.
Thank you. Aspiring geographer here, not really an atmospherics climate scientist, but I didn't really understand how, when you merge the thermals and you get a higher thermal density, why does that create more vertical development compared to when you merge a lot of thermals together, and the strength of those thermals, do they not transfer?
So why do we have a stronger mass flux when we have a high density of thermals? Is it your question?
Yes.
It's because when we have a high density of thermals, we have a high density of cloud shoots like that, and through merging that produces large cloud bases. And we can measure this. Actually, every aspect of this cartoon is supported by observations. And when we have a high density of thermals, we produce larger cloud bases. And if the cloud base is wider, or the clouds are wider, they can grow deeper because they are less affected by the turbulent mixing that takes place at the edge of the cloud, and that reduces the buoyancy.
So the cloud bases are really
So the clouds are indeed deeper when there is a weak thermal merging.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And since the mic's there, Neil, try and keep this question short. Thank you.
I'll keep the question short. So thanks for a really, really illuminating talk. Fascinating to see what you've extracted from these field observations. A lot of us have had a lot of excitement, but also trepidation using these kilometer scale models. And I'm wondering, it's probably early days, but whether this process that you've shown in the thermals is kind of an Achilles heel of these models. And if boundary layer parameterizations were better representing these, we might end up with the difference of convective organizations between different kilometer scales being far more reduced. So is this an Achilles heel, do you think, in the current models' boundary layer parameterizations?
Well, I don't know how the thermals look like in those kilometer scale models, to be honest. That's something I'd like to look at, but I haven't started to look at this. And I don't know how the convective clouds in those kilometer scale models are rooted in the boundary layer. That's the first thing we should look at to understand how we can connect this to what the models are doing. I could imagine that there are some updrafts in the boundary layer in those models, but which are really wide. And actually, one value of understanding how these things work like that is that maybe we will be able to understand why when using a model at the kilometer scale instead of at finer resolutions, we distort the organization of clouds. Maybe we'll be able to interpret the biases of the organization based on what we understand from the routing of clouds in the boundary layer. But I suspect that, the representation of the boundary layer in these models matters for the organization of clouds.
Thanks. Yeah, did you have a last question, Ray?
Sure, yes.
You were waving your arms earlier on. It may have been answered already. There's no obligation.
So I'd like to go off on a different tangent about climate sensitivity. So as of a few IPC see reports back, and as in some of your earlier work, most of the spread in climate sensitivity in models was due to low cloud effects. When I look at your pictures and the physics involved, it looks like there are plenty of ways models could be getting high clouds wrong. And so I was wondering whether, as we go into CMIP6 and so forth, has the situation changed? Are high clouds now contributing anything to the spread in climate sensitivity? And if not, why not? Because it seems like there's a lot of leverage in high clouds, and we don't know how to do those either.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of research on this question. So indeed, for a long time, this large uncertainty in climate sensitivity was coming from the response of shallow cumuli. And actually, when we organized the Eureka Field campaign, it was to answer the question of what are the processes controlling those clouds, and can we reduce the uncertainty? And so that I didn't talk at all about this here, but what we've shown is that the models that were producing a high climate sensitivity due to shallow cumuli were the models that represented shallow cumuli in a very unrealistic way, because they just controlled the clouds based on humidity, while in observations, the clouds are not controlled much by humidity. They are controlled mostly by the vertical motions, by the mass flux, by convection, not by the relative humidity of the atmosphere. And so, based on Eureka, we could rule out those very strong cloud feedbacks coming from shallow cumuli in the models because they had the wrong processes. Now, regarding the second part of your question regarding the role of high-level clouds, it's been shown recently that now the high-level clouds are thought to contribute more to the uncertainty in climate sensitivity than in the past. Maybe because now models are a little bit better in reproducing low-level clouds. But on this topic, a lot of progress has been done in research. Really, we much better understand what controls the height of this clouds, and even the impact of changes in the cloud fraction of these high clouds on climate sensitivity. And I've been involved in one of the studies, but there are at least 3 studies now showing that the feedback associated with changes in the cloud fraction of high-level clouds is thought to be very weak. Yeah.
I can't resist adding that despite the fact that you've ruled out that very powerful low-level climate sensitivity feedback, the feedback affecting climate sensitivity, it's taken a long time to die. There's still models out there that do it. Anyway, but
model
maybe we should be braver about pensioning off models that get things wrong. On that note, shall we thank Sandrine once again for a great lecture, and you're all very, very welcome to a reception just outside to mark this year's Halley Lecture. But it's mainly marked by Sandrine's fantastic lecture. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.